Great. Hi, everyone, and thank you for attending the Kuumba Kickback. Welcome to this live episode of Dreaming in the Dark. Dreaming in the Dark is a podcast created by Black fantasy scholars Bezi, Yohannes, and Ravynn K. Stringfield that brings the stories they wish they had as children to the forefront. Named after Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, their podcast celebrates the creations that center those usually written in the margins of the fantastic. So thank you both for joining. I'm going to just pass it off to you.
All right, thank you. Well, I'm Ravynn.
And I'm Bezi.
And you're listening to Dreaming in the Dark, the Black fantasy podcast of your dreams.
Dreaming in the Dark is a podcast created by Bezi Yohannes and Ravynn K. Stringfield, two Black girls with a love of magic that brings the stories we wish we had as children to the forefront. Named after visionary Toni Morrison's treasured critical analysis Playing in the Dark, our podcast celebrates the creations that center those usually written in the margins of the fantastic. The aim of Dreaming in the Dark is to craft a place where we explore our visions for Black futures and freedoms and play in the worlds created by Black artists, scholars, and writers.
This is a very special episode of Dreaming in the Dark since we are here recording live with Black Girls Create during their 2021 Kuumba Kickback weekend event. So we will be talking about how we do what we do, from creating Black fantasy itself to critically consuming and promoting the stories that we love. So how about we start, Bezi, with just this question of how you decide what type of media that you consume. What questions do you ask yourself when deciding to engage with new media?
Yeah, so I love fantasy. We started this podcast from a love of fantasy. And so my media that I'm drawn to the most obviously always starts with the fantastical and fantasy. Although I will say, to go on a little bit of a contextual side street in this, that fantasy, I think, as a genre definition, is often limited or tried to be limited by ideas of, magic and dragons and whatnot. And I think that not only does fantasy overlap with sci-fi and horror and other aspects of, speculative fiction more broadly, but I also feel like in media, including television and movies, there's a way that historical dramas and even contemporary stuff will play in speculative spaces because of the extent to which adaptations take liberties. And I think that has always sort of fascinated me before I understood why I was still drawn to it, even though I loved fantasy. I love a lot of historical dramas. Anyone who knows me or follows me knows that I love things like BBC's Musketeers, Black Sails, and I love them because I think it's really interesting to see that they are adaptations, and even fantastical adaptations, just as much as things with dragons and magic, because of the extent to which they say history is malleable and history is what we need it to be, to, campy or fun effect. They're not necessarily taking themselves too seriously, which I love. But I think that the idea that allo history, which is also, a subgenre of speculative fiction, alternative history, history is something that's malleable, that can be changed, that can be reimagined for what the needs of the present are, is something that's really fascinating to me in adaptations, and I think is an inherently fantastical practice. And so that media that participates in that practice is also something that I find really fascinating. And I like to critique it in the same space and with a lot of the same language as I do fantasy. What about you, Ravynn? What media inspires you and draws you into it so much that then you engage in critique?
Yeah, for me, it's funny that you mentioned this, the idea of alternate histories and things like that, because actually what I think invigorates me the most is, sorry if you can hear scratching in the background, it's my dog. But the thing that invigorates me the most about fantasy is actually usually future. When I can see into the future, it doesn't have to be like sci-fi in that way, because I think we often think about sci-fi as very futuristic. But I also think fantasy has the potential to offer us ways to think about the future. So, for example, I really love when future and fantasy go together, when it's an opportunity for someone to really cut loose the bounds of what they think is possible, right? And it doesn't even necessarily have to be dragons and castles and princesses and all of that, the high epic fantasy. What I also like about fantasy and really speculation writ large is that you can come to something and say, I want to imagine a reality, like a real thing that I will live in 5-10 years in the future. So one thing that I've been, I think, talking about for probably the last month is, I read Akwaeke and Bezi's Pet, which takes place like immediately post revolution, right? Like maybe in the few years past revolution. And yes, it's fantastical in the sense that, Pet is a creature that comes out of one of her mother's paintings, right? And so there's this like kind of inexplicable thing, just like walking around her house. Her parents are like, okay, like, what is this? I'm hunting. What do you hunt? That sort of thing. But also the fantasy is in, Akwaeke and Bezi has really let loose and tried to design what they think is possible, right? Like, they are thinking about this world. They have imagined this world in which it's post-revolution, where communities, there are no more billionaires, there's no more police, communities handle sort of what they like, any sort of like assaults or anything like that. They try to handle it in community, that sort of thing. And so it's not, to me, just about like all of the fun, like high flying things, even though it often is. But I love the sort of intellectual exercise of saying, I can use fantasy to truly chart out what I think can be in my lifetime, right? Like, not just, my kids or anything like that, but what can the world I walk down the street, what can it look like in 5 to 10 years? Like, you have to give yourself permission to imagine that. And writing fantasy helps you execute, I think. What do you think?
Yes, absolutely love all of that. I think the, Afrofuturism, of course, and the nature of futurist thought is so exciting in fantasy, and exciting in sort of Black-led movements in speculative fiction. Afrofuturism is so rife with potential in all the literature that's coming out, and the movies and shows and things that are sort of finally exploring that in a mainstream space. But yeah, I think the cool thing about fantasy is that it encompasses the past and the present and the future. I think all of those spaces offer things to explore, offer ways to critique them and study them, and engage with them in exciting and new ways. So it is really cool to hear how we are approaching those things, and both of us also flip sides, so to speak. I just spoke to the past and you just spoke to the future, but I feel like, in past episodes that we've talked about, you've talked about comics history in a way that delves into sort of the past of fantasy and speculative, and I've talked about Afrofuturism and some of the books that I've read, and that inspired me to come into Black fantasy. Afrofuturism was the start of that for me. So it really it can go either way, and I think exploring all aspects of that is really cool, and an opportunity that we have with our podcast and with our amazing guests that come on. So to move on, a natural sort of flow from that, what does critique look like for you as we explore these different spaces in fantasy, and what writers, artists, and thinkers informed how you approached critique?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because I'm pretty sure that if you asked almost anyone in the academy around me, they'd probably say that I'm not doing it right. Like, just to, first of all, I think part of it, to contextualize, Bezi and I are both scholars. Bezi got her MA and in English, and I'm working on my PhD in American Studies. And I, part of the whole thing of being a scholar and going to grad school is that you have to like critique these works. You have to sort of like break them apart to see how it's functioning. And that sort of thing, to sort of get the most out of the book that you can to help you build your own arguments, right? And so when I'm thinking about critique, I still want to be able to build something out of it. Like, I feel like when you're a grad student, you're taught very much to critique and break and destroy. You just leave it in a crumpled mess on the ground, right? Like, you just break it apart. You like go into it and you say it's missing X, Y, and Z thing, when that really wasn't what the author was trying to do in the first place. But you have identified the like 10 things it's missing, that it doesn't speak to, and that is what, as a grad student, you're taught to do and that's critique, right? I don't find that very valuable or generative. So so basically, when I approach critique, I do find the practice of breaking it apart into its constitutive pieces very fruitful, in that I see how the different individual parts relate to other pieces and relate to, like, I'm then taking it and then making connections to other authors and writers. So if there's like a piece from one thing that I'm reading, I can then say, okay, well, based on these 3 to 5 other texts that I've read on the same subject, does this support, does it go away from, what does it set me up to do, right? Like, I think ultimately critique is only as useful as like what you're going to do with it, right? Like, critique for critique's sake, it doesn't really do much for me. But critique to build, like critique to, you identify what's wrong or like what's missing. You do that sort of like breaking it apart. And then I like to go a step further and say, well, okay, if this is how I've broken it up, what can I build from these pieces? Where can I go from here? If this is true, what then is my responsibility as a writer or a scholar to sort of, talk into these gaps, talk into the missing pieces? Like, what does it do then? It should help you build. It should help you move forward. It should help you say, this is what I want for myself in the future. And so, like, just as an example, my students, when I taught a class sort of on this material, these sort of themes, I gave them a writing prompt one day, because they were very, very good at critique, like that first kind, right? Like that first kind of like breaking things apart. Like, I see all the things that are wrong with this, like all the cracks in the wall, all that sort of stuff. And so I told them, do that. And then in this space, I want you to tell me what you would build with that, right? Like, what if this is what you don't want to see in your fantasy narratives, if this is not what you want to see in the media that you're consuming, what then would be the characteristics? What then would be the sort of guiding praxis, so to speak, of what would work for you? Because that's the first way to build things, right? Like, I think that's, so critique and building are very intertwined for me. And that's kind of how I approach fantasy. It's a very long-winded thing, but I've had a long time to sort of think through these things, because I've been in grad school. This is my 6th year. But Bezi, as you are thinking about critiquing things, as a scholar, but also as a fan, like, how do you approach it? And like, who are you talking to? Like, who are you in conversation with? Because I didn't mention that, but I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, so I feel like it did maybe take me a while to get to how to critique properly, because I think a lot of my early encounters with the concept of critique, like you said, in academia, were deconstruction entirely. And specifically deconstruction of white writers, which was something that I not only was like, I don't like this because I can't connect, like, why do I care enough to want to break this apart? And then it was, why am I only breaking this apart? So there was sort of 2 layers of frustration for me in that space. Although I, like, quote unquote, got good at it, like I was able to, like, do well in classes. It never really meant anything to me specifically, this idea of critique, until I got to writing my undergraduate thesis first, and then, working in grad school, where I was finally presented with texts that I cared enough to try and actually deconstruct in order to understand them better, in order to better, understand my love for them. Specifically, first Black fantasy novels like N.K. Jemisin and Nnedi Okorafor, these authors who are writing some of the first stories that I read in fantastical, in the speculative, with Black characters in Black worlds. Those were the texts where I was so invested in them. I was like, let me understand how they did it. I want to understand what they're doing. Then I moved into, after reading Playing in the Dark, which, our podcast takes the name from, for me, reading Toni Morrison's analysis of what critical race work in literature was, and the critical race deconstruction of American literature, helped me understand what critique could be, period, of the American white canon of literature, of media that had conceptualized Blackness in every single media space as this unspeakable, as unspoken, as Toni Morrison names it, this way that Blackness undergirds all of the darkness and fear and the frontier and the exploration aspects of the fantastical. And that also, by the way, to sort of speak to what I said earlier, inspired what I understood of how the fantastical interacts with the past, because so much of Playing in the Dark is Toni Morrison breaking down how there was revisionist history sort of happening in these fictional works of the American canon, where it was sort of conceptualizing an American myth that needed Blackness to sort of help it coalesce. And in doing all of that, then, it was Playing in the Dark that inspired me. It was then sort of culminating and going back to a lot of the fantasy that I loved growing up, things that I've talked about often on the podcast, BBC's Merlin, Brandy Cinderella, Princess and the Frog, some of the childhood media that I grew up with, and the first spaces that I saw Black people in fantasy, and realizing I needed to deconstruct those, again, for the reason that I had not yet done that deconstruction, and before I could move into a full understanding of what the fantasy was that I needed and wanted to see, I had to go back to the beginning, so to speak. I had to sort of retrace my steps and start with where did we diverge from the path? Where did the fantasies begin? Where did those fantasies get twisted into white supremacist spaces? Into a misunderstanding of who I was and what I could be. And for me, it was a deeply personal thing. So I think for me, critique always began with good critique. The critique that I actually cared about began as something deeply personal. The more invested I am in something, the more the deconstruction is not just, objective. It's not just to tear it apart. It's to better understand the pieces that make up what I am and who I am. And that has been empowering. I think to some extent people sometimes get frustrated with how I interact with pop culture, because it's so, now that level of critique is so built into me that now it's very hard for me to just approach casually pop culture, especially, Black characters in fantasy, without that part of my brain switching on. And I get it. It is frustrating, but it also, for me, is part of my passion for it. Again, if I don't care about it, I'm not going to invest energy in it. But if I care and if I see it making an impact on media and the pop culture landscape, then I am more invested in the idea of, can we talk about what this is doing? Can we talk about what is happening here in the imaginations that it is sort of setting for us? And how do we break it apart? How do we take it apart for its pieces and then understand those pieces for what they are, so that when we do get to good representation, when we get to authors like Bethany C. Morrow and Roseanne Brown and Tracy Dion, who are writing these amazing stories that I hope will get adapted into film and or TV. But when we get to those stories, we can then look at them with an understanding of what came before and what was wrong, and what was good, what was also salvageable there, and then see where we are now and sort of put those things in comparison with each other. But it's a process that I think involves context. It shouldn't be a decontextualizing of history, of fantastical histories of where Black characters have existed, even, at cost to the development of those characters. As, again, to cite another person, Ebony Elizabeth Thomas deconstructs in The Dark Fantastic. And as many of those actors, for example, in Black media have come out and said that they have suffered harm towards the cause of trying to bring about representation or visibility, that they have suffered in those spaces. So how do we honor what has been done in order to build something better? So that went very long.
Oh no, I mean, I think it's so incredible to hear you talk about it. I mean, again, this is so much of why we started the podcast, is because we have these have these conversations, and we're like, other people need to be involved in these. But when you brought up Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, I think and also your point about starting with Toni Morrison, like the point about learning how to do good critique starting with like Black women is really, like, I think we can't gloss over that, right? Like, I think we really have to hit that home, because I think for me too, like in grad school, I didn't really enjoy a lot of what I was doing until I could identify Black writers, and they were often Black women writers who were doing what I wanted to do, what I saw was possible. And I saw Ebony Elizabeth Thomas's The Dark Fantastic, and I got so excited. I think I got an early copy of it. And I was fascinated that someone could do critique like this and could engage these texts like this. And what I'll also say is, part of this, for me also, is as a writer, as a creative person, and as a like artist, all of that stuff. I'm also thinking about critique, not just in a scholarly way, but I'm also thinking about breaking it down so that I can study it in a way that I can then incorporate those skills and those pieces into my own writing, right? Like, and into my own art. So, again, I feel like we're not taking things a little far enough. I think so much of this has to be like, are you really, like, what does true engagement with a text mean? What does it look like? I think some of that is what we have to ask ourselves.
Exactly. No, I think there's a very, I mean, not to penalize people, I think this might come across sounding snobby, but I think there is a way that there's a very casual, quote unquote, critique that often makes its way into pop culture spaces of just not even real deconstruction, but sort of calls itself deconstruction, that's considered engagement, where it's just like, oh, you post a Twitter hot take, you're done, and it's like, the more, and I can't penalize that, because I think to some extent, especially non-marginalized, and non-Black audiences don't necessarily care. Like, they don't care enough to invest that time and energy into critique the way that we are doing. But when it's about you in a way that you have not seen yourself represented or seen on TV or in media or in a story before, you're going to care more. You're going to want the best, and you're going to want a variety. You're going to want to see yourself represented in different ways in different spaces. And so that's why we do what we do, because we care so much, investing, the extra hours and hours and hours in talking about the things that we love and the things that we don't love and the things we kind of love, but also, have issues with. Like, that's part of showing the passion that we have for getting it right. And also I'm looking at the comments. The fun thing about doing this live episode is I see y'all in the YouTube comments. And so thank you everybody for interacting. I'm noticing, some people are commenting that they didn't have the opportunity to read many Black writers until grad school, which is kind of ridiculous. Yes, you are absolutely right. I agree with that, because it was the same for me. The first time I had a sustained Black writers, African-American women writers class specifically, shout out to Professor Suzette Spencer, who I shout out all the time on Twitter, but she's at William & Mary. She was one of the first professors who genuinely guided us through both Black feminist theory, alongside Black lit. And that truly transformed how I thought about critique. That was the first, sort of encounter with understanding how to do scholarship in a way that I connected to, and not just in an objective, neutral academic sense that they tell you to in white spaces because they think whiteness is the neutral. But this idea that you could invest your identity into the story, and that your personal experience and perspective and the personal experiences of theorists and writers wasn't something to be discounted. It was something that made them better critics of society and of history and of art, was transformative. And I think that maybe I wasn't at the maturity yet also to receive that until grad school or close to grad school. But I hope and, pray that that's something that is also being passed down. And I know with classes like Ravyn's and with Ravyn's students, it's starting earlier and earlier, which is great. Because I think, maybe I wasn't there yet, but would have received it.
Yeah, I think for me, I remember very vividly being in the 9th grade and having to read Their Eyes Were Watching God. I had a Black English teacher. My Ivy Lit class was I would say fairly diverse. But I just remember one of the white boys in the class was he didn't like to read it because he couldn't understand the language in it. And I remember being being 14 and being sound it out. I very vividly remember being no, this makes perfect sense. What are you talking about? But I think the study, so I was already starting to have those questions, think about those things. But again, so much of this comes from if you don't have people who are willing to lovingly take you through that sort of theory, that sort of literature. As Professor Spencer for Bezi, for me, I'm very fortunate. You wouldn't, I guess probably wouldn't think it, but the University of Virginia actually had a pretty solid number of really amazing African American studies professors that were in English and history. And so for me, the really formative people were Claudrina Harold in history, and Lisa Woolfolk in English. And so I had a very similar sort of experience to Bezi, breaking down the feminist theory in her class, working on those things. But really, I want to say the biggest thing was getting out of my own way, because I was very sure that I knew what was going on and that I understood how to do what I thought she wanted me to do. But on the first day, she very, very lovingly corrected me and was that's not what we're doing in here. So are you sure about that? And that everyone has their own take on how you should do in the classroom, but I will always remember being gathered in that really loving way.
Yeah, no, Professor Spencer did the exact same thing to me. And I remember at the time, I was so not shocked because I feel like the earliest encounters we have with that as Black girls is your mom. Like your mom sort of being like, gathering you up. But I remember being like, that was not something that I had encountered in the classroom before. The idea that the professor sort of started the class off with everything that you think you know about critique, everything that's been taught to you so far. And at that point, I was a junior, I think. I forget, I was a senior. No, I was a junior. And I had, obviously done several years of college and English classes at this point. I was almost done with my major, I think, in fact. And she was like, no, everything that you thought you had learned at this point, stop. Do not bring it. Your first essays are going to be bad. Like, just accept that. And I was like, excuse me, I have great essays. And she was like, no, they will all be bad. This is not something you've practiced before. And so we're going to start from the ground up and reteach you how to engage in critique. And I was like, what? And she was right. My first essay was maybe good academically, but it was not good in the practice that she was trying to teach us of how to critically examine texts, Black feminist texts from Black feminist theory. It was not a theory I was familiar with, and it was not texts that I had engaged with in that way. So I was approaching it like, white academia had taught me to approach it, and I had to unlearn it. And that's the same, I think, thing that I'm chasing in when I approach the media that I love, like, things like Merlin and Princess and the Frog and whatever, however childish people may think they are, I'm still approaching it with that same mentality of let's start from scratch. Everything that I thought I knew about this movie or this show that I loved, that I cared about, that I wrote Tumblr essays for, start from the beginning. Let's start from what is the actual text, so to speak, of the movie saying? What is the text of the show saying and doing? Whether or not I saw it when I first was encountering it, how do I now see it with new eyes and analyze it with new eyes? And I think it's very difficult to unlearn things that you have invested emotional energy in that way. But it's valuable, definitely a valuable practice.
Yeah, I think this conversation about critique sort of drives us to think about how it informs the other things that we do, because I also, both of us are very involved as fans, as artists, as writers, that sort of thing. So maybe we should talk a little bit about how, critique informs our process for creating. And if you want, I can go ahead and sort of like talk about writing, just because it's like on my on my brain right now. But I think so much of what critique does for me is it allows me to speak into the gap, right? Like it's so exciting when you like it's one thing to be able to identify a gap. It is another thing to be able to create something to go in it, and it's very exciting to me. It's very cool. And so a lot of my fantasy narratives are like me realizing that, at least in my encounterings, I haven't seen this sort of thing before. And this is it's very much the whole Toni Morrison thing of, if there's a book that you want to read that doesn't exist or you haven't seen it, like write it yourself. And so, but in order to know what is there and what isn't, you have to read, you have to engage, you have to like go out there and like work the media and see what does and does not exist. And so for me, that was easy. I was a kid that like took books everywhere. I always took two. I took one in case I took two in case I finished the first one, right? Like I was very, like, I loved reading. I still love reading. I still love watching all of these narratives. And so eventually I got to a point where I could say, like, for example, I really love soft fantasy. And I don't know how else to describe it. Think like Twitches, right? Like think like it's high fantasy, princesses and stuff. It might also in some ways be contemporary fantasy also, like, I think would describe what I'm getting at. But it's like, think Twitches, think it's like reality, except like, you can like twitch your nose or something and then the salt shaker rattles. That sort of stuff. Like, I love that. Like Bewitched and Sabrina the Teenage, like the sort of actually the perfect example is That's So Raven, right? Like, I didn't even actually categorize That's So Raven as fantasy until it came on Disney Plus, and I saw that as a category they had fantasy, and I was like, oh yeah, like like, absolutely. Like, it's like she's just a normal kid, like, doing hijinks or whatever, but she has visions of the future. Yeah, it's fantasy. And I love stuff like that. Like, I love stuff that's just like, you want to have these like random interpersonal dramas and like kind of family issues or whatever that just is made even more difficult because the kid doesn't have total control over their powers, right? Like, it's very chaotic, very messy, very wholesome. Like, I mean, I would almost say, like, imagine if the Babysitters Club kids, like, the children they were babysitting, like, had tiny powers or something. Like, like, that sort of stuff is
Don't
what
give
I
away all your
love.
good ideas, girl. Save some of these ideas. They need to all be novels. I want to read all of these stories. Don't give them out for free.
I will not. I'm just like trying to just, I think, describe the type of like stuff that I love, right? Like, that's like, I
Definitely,
just
definitely.
want, yeah, like, it's just the aesthetic. Like, I like, trust me, like, when I say I love a good high fantasy, I love a good high fantasy. I love a good contemporary fantasy, but I also am I'm very soft. Like, I'm basically a marshmallow. Like, I really like vibey stuff. Like, I like cute stuff. Like pets, talking animal. Like, I just really love, like, I just want softness all of the time. And I think that's also just like part of the issue. I think, also when we talk about representation, um like, why do stories that have this like soft magic, why do they not often involve Black people? Because, like, why does it have to be like gritty and dark, and like, why do we have to be adults before our time, and that sort of energy? Like, I want magic where the kid is a kid, right? Like, I don't want them to have to necessarily be the chosen one. Like, I want them to be able to go to school and, like, they've like magically sealed their locker or something, because that's just what happens, right? Like, um, it also kind of brings us back to this question of critique, like, and enables us to ask these sort of larger questions about why is the representation like that, and what can we do about it, right?
Yes, I totally agree because I think for me, I love the princess. I'm also a big soft fantasy girl, and there was also comments about Geneva Bowers, who does amazing art. That I literally am staring at a gallery wall I have of her art right now because it's so inspiring to me and is so specifically. And Ravynn, yes, and Ravynn also loves. We are both big fans of Geneva Bowers. I met her at New York Comic Con this weekend and gushed. But yes, this idea of soft fantasy for me, the idea specifically of the princess. I mean, there's so much about fantasy that I love. So many different tropes and concepts and characters and whatnot. For example, another one is pirates. That's a little bit of a different space for me that I would unpack maybe in a later episode. But the idea of the princess has always been one of the like earliest and core memories I've associated with fantasy, starting with the idea that the Pevensey kids go to Narnia from their contemporary world to this other world and are automatically sort of princes and princesses of Narnia. Loved that as a kid, still love it as an adult. Also love, though, the critiques that I've seen of people sort of talking about what are the colonialist ideas in that premise. It's like, oh, I never thought about that. That is so interesting. So this idea of like, what does it mean to have outside people who automatically become princes and princesses of your land? Like, ooh, interesting. Another one, of course, is one that I talk about often, Gwen, who is cast as a Black woman in BBC's Merlin, and how she's treated by the fandom, how her character is treated by the fandom. But the inherent premise that a Black woman could be queen, not only princess, but queen, in this myth that is so central to a British white imagining, it's so rich to me in so many different ways. And the first way that I was drawn to it as a child was just this picture of Gwen with her natural hair sitting on that throne. And I knew in the deepest of my heart, I was like, I want to explore this. Whatever this signifies to me, whatever it means, I want to unpack it and understand what the myth of the princess does for me. Why does it mean so much? And I've looked at it in a lot of different ways. And I think the princess and that image, that trope, that character is something that is tied to a lot of soft fantasy. It's also tied to a lot of high otherworld fantasy. And it's tied to this idea of, what does it mean to be treasured, to be pampered, to have power, to rule, and to, have those things together, to be able to be soft and also powerful. How is that depicted for Black women? How are Black women allowed to be both soft and powerful? How could we be allowed to be depicted as both soft and powerful? So I love seeing stories that go into that. And I love the ways that, authors like Roseanne Brown in Song of Race and Ruin sort of address that in the character of Karina, who is a controversial character because she is a Black princess and she has contradicting emotions. And I love that. I love that it's messy, because I think at its best, the myth of the princess is one that allows us to explore both softness and pampering and being treasured, and sitting in luxury, but also exerting power over our circumstances, over our being, over our agency. And so I love characters by Black authors and by Black creators that are able to explore that contradiction. Yes, everybody, and also everybody in the comments loves soft fantasy. And also seeing some love for Karina. Yes, I don't think she's controversial. I have heard controversy about her. I love her unreservedly. I think both her and Malik in the story are both my soft babies, but they are soft babies in different ways. And we love them.
Very much so. I was going to say, when we talked to Rosie in season 1, like, that was her thing, right? She was saying that she very much envisioned Karina to be like soft princess. And that's not how she came out on the page, right? Like, that was such a cool thing to talk to her about. Like, Karina's still a tough baby, but she's allowed to be, I think, a little bit fuller, as you said. And I like, so folks, if you haven't gone to listen to that interview that we did with Rosie, absolutely run, because it's great. We talk a lot about that. I think for me, my trope, or my type of character, is definitely witches, which I think, unfortunately, I do attribute a lot of it to Harry Potter, because that was what I was reading when I was growing up. But as I got older, and I started to think more about it, and also when I got to grad school, I had opportunities to really read about the history of Blackness and spirituality and magics and our and where it comes from and all of that sort of stuff. And so I got really, for me, I got super into thinking about magic in the Afro-diasporic tradition, and just what it means to be able to use plants, know what plants are, herbs, things like that, be in tune with what's going on with the celestial bodies and that sort of stuff. It's a different type of knowledge that we're just not expected to know or to nurture or hone anymore. It's a very intuitive, there's also just a lot about intuition. And so I'm always very interested in depictions of Black women with these moments of intuition, or these moments of recognizing that the spirit of their mother or their grandmother or something, or even in Toni Morrison's case, the spirit of beloved, right? That what does that do to have to be able to know that your ancestors are walking with you, What does it mean to have that connection, that like intuitive connection to what's going to like being in yourself. Like we're so exploited for labor, I think a lot of times, that we don't have opportunities to really just be one with like what's going on in our bodies. Like we don't really think a lot about what we eat, what we drink. We're just going all the time because I mean, this is like a byproduct of capitalism and like neoliberalism, whatever. But we are told that we have to work all of the time, right? Like we are conditioned to believe that our worth is tied um to how much we're producing. And I think for me, I still struggle with that. Like I'm not saying that like I'm an expert on like relaxing and all of that stuff now. But what studying like Black spirituality and these questions of like religion and that sort of thing, it it like makes you stop. You have to stop and think about those things. It just asks you to think about, okay, I'm putting this sort of this food in my body. I don't feel well when I do that. What can I do to replace it, so that I do have more energy, or I'm less anxious, or things like that. And it's just it asks you to consider what your relationship is to nature, to the things that are literally around you, right? Like it asks you to stop and think about stuff like that. Um, so that's kind of how I got there recently. It spiraled into, it was like definitely a thing when I was younger, but I got very deep into it. I think it's really important to, as much as we love fantasy as just sort of like this, whole separate thing, I think it's also just important to think about the ways that a lot of this is really rooted in our histories and our legacies, and to think about it in that way. Yeah.
And that brings us wonderfully full circle to sort of one of the first points I made, which is the way that fantasy looks into the past, and the ways that we understand our histories and what the traumas and the struggles that built us, but then also are creating softness and hope in our present to build a better future. And with that, we're probably going to start wrapping up, but I do want to quickly address, because some people asked for recommendations in the comments, and I know we threw out a bunch of titles that I think, podcast listeners who have been following us will know those titles, but to back up for people who are new to Dreaming in the Dark, we recommend A Song of Race and Ruin by Roseanne Brown. We recommend Legend Born by Tracy Dion. Anything by Bethany C. Morrow, anything by N.K. Jemisin, anything by Anandia Okorafor. Some of these are the greats. The big authors right now writing in YA and adult Black fantasy. And then also there are so many amazing new works coming out. Kaylin Barron was just on the podcast with us this season, who wrote This Poison Heart most recently, also wrote Cinderella is Dead, which is a story that I held near and dear to my heart last year, because of how it explored the Cinderella concept, which is, tied to a lot of that princess mythology, with a Black protagonist, with a Black girl in a world post Cinderella, in a world where Cinderella is titularly dead. And there are new authors. Jessica Lewis wrote Bad Witch Burning, for people who want more witchy things that are, as Ravynn spoke about. So Many Beginnings by Bethany C. Morrow. I'm looking at my TBR to make sure I give y'all all the cool recs. But these are all books and authors that are exploring the kinds of worlds that we are talking about that we want to see. And in terms of, for people who are asking about some of the things that I'm referencing for, things that I'm exploring, I think a lot of that media like BBC Merlin, that had a Black Guinevere, Black Sails that had Maddie as the princess character of the show, heir, so to speak. A lot of these Black characters in mainstream fantasy were white media. And so starting from that assumption of how does the Dark Fantastic cycle, with word to Ebony Elizabeth Thomas's book, titularly The Dark Fantastic, how does the Dark Fantastic cycle play out in representations of Black women in fantasy that have come before in the mainstream? That's sort of where I start for looking at the princess archetype in fantasy for Black girls as it stands. So those are a lot of the stories that come to the forefront of my mind when I start talking about, visibility versus representation. But now that we've cited some of our influences, oh yes, absolutely.
I just wanted to quickly throw out some scholars. If you are interested in sort of thinking about things critically, as Bezi mentioned, we love Ebony Elizabeth Thomas's The Dark Fantastic. We also had S.R. Tolliver, Stephanie Renee Tolliver, on our podcast this season, who's got a book coming out in November about endarkened storytelling. She is such a cool person, and her work is amazing. I can't wait to see more of it. And somebody who, we haven't actually talked much about, but who I really like, Sammy Shulk is a professor of English and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And her book, Body Minds Reimagined, talks about speculative fiction and disability studies, if you're interested in that sort of thing. We could go on and on, but I just wanted to throw out a couple more in case you're interested in doing some scholarly work.
Definitely. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And we're happy to share where our listeners, new and old, can find us, as well as other work they can look forward to seeing from the both of us. So I'm being a bookworm on Instagram, Twitter, and only somewhat recently TikTok. And besides my work for Penguin Young Readers, where I work as a digital marketing assistant, so you'll see me pop up on Penguin Teen and Penguin Kids social medias, I'm working on a couple secret Black fantasy projects that I can't talk about yet, but may or may not have and be in collaboration with some of our previous illustrious guests on the podcast.
And I'm at Ravynn Kamia, RAVYNNKAMIA, on Instagram and Twitter. You can find me on my website at ravynnkstringfield.com. And actually, I'm currently writing a column over at Catapult Magazine about superhero girlfriends. So if you're interested in more of my favorite tropes, you could go check that out. But I think that's all we have for you this time. So thanks for joining us this week on Dreaming in the Dark. See you next time.
Cool. Thank you for doing this. That was amazing. I feel like so many recs, so much knowledge. And thank you to our audience for joining. Remember, these panels are recorded, so if you missed something or want to come back in the future, you'll be able to find all these panels on the Black Girls Create YouTube channel. Our next panel, Divesting from White Fandom, will happen in about 15 minutes or so, which should give you time to get water, a snack, chat with folks in Discord, and check out our virtual artist alley on our website. So yeah, thank you for joining, and we'll see you at the next panel.